So this is the presentation of the child safeguarding by Rachel Lovebook from Sport Integrity Australia, who's been kind enough to present for us at Water Polo Australia. So I just ask everyone to hold any questions that they have until the end, and I'll let Rachel get started. Thanks, Rachel.
Thank you so much for having me here today. Before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands that we are meeting on today. So I'm actually coming to you from Melbourne, which is the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I would also like to acknowledge and welcome other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may be attending today's meeting. Just some brief housekeeping. If you feel comfortable, please feel free to leave your camera on, but please be aware that I can't actually see anybody while I'm presenting. So I will make sure that there is some time for questions at the end. So please do keep track of any questions you may have, and I'll be sure to get to them at the end of the presentation. And in keeping with the online environment, if you wouldn't mind, please keeping your microphone on mute until we get to the question component. That would be very much appreciated. Now, before we go any further, hopefully everyone can see my slides are changing okay, and that's all good. Let me know if anything is an issue. Fantastic. I do have some voice and sound that will be coming through towards the middle of the presentation. So if anything is an issue, just let me know and I will take care of it from my end. Fingers crossed, we have no technological issues. At this point in time, I would like to acknowledge survivors. So we acknowledge the pain and harm caused to victims and survivors of child abuse in sport. We acknowledge and pay respect to survivors of abuse as their courage informs the work of Sport Integrity Australia. And on that note, I would like to flag that there is a self-care warning today, that some of the examples that I use today potentially could be triggering. So please do feel free to leave if you need to. Look after yourselves. It can be distressing, but it is such important content that we're covering here today. The content of this training material is about safeguarding children in sport. So you may experience a wide range of emotions, including sadness or discomfort as you hear some of the content. Now, this can be experienced on a personal level on behalf of children and families who have been the victims of child abuse, or on behalf of children and families that you may actually know personally. If the content does trigger an emotional response that you are unable to deal with, it is important to get support, be it from your partner, supervisor or colleagues, or anyone else that you feel comfortable with. And of course, we have shared today some of the key resources that are available to you. We'd ask that you take care of yourself, and if you do need to take a break, please feel free to do so. Okay, now I do know that you've had a brief introduction to Sport Integrity Australia, so I won't go into too much detail in relation to this. Some of you may already be aware of the many functions of Sport Integrity Australia. Usually it's in relation to anti-doping and competition manipulation areas of our agency. So I sit within the safeguarding unit, where our key focus is on child safeguarding and member protection. For the millions of children and young people participating in sports across Australia today, sport provides a space to learn new skills, to be part of a team, and for a lucky few to start the journey to a professional career doing something that they truly love. Sport should be safe. It should be an enabling environment that allows children to belong, free from harassment, discrimination, bullying, and abuse. Sport may, in fact, at times be the one place that a child feels safe. So as part of my presentation today, I will give a very brief overview of the National Integrity Framework, predominantly in terms of how it relates to the safeguarding and to a lesser degree, member protection policy areas. I will be looking at the need for safeguarding in sport in Australia and looking at some of the recent events that have got us to the position that we are in today. And of course, I will spend a fair bit of time touching on what prohibited conduct and child safe practices in this space look like. As I mentioned before, there will of course be some time for questions at the end. And of course, you can always feel comfortable to reach out to our safeguarding team after the presentation if you have anything further that you would like to discuss. In terms of background, and I won't really talk to the other areas that I believe have been covered already, in relation to safeguarding and member protection, we're looking to assist sports and individuals to provide a safe sporting environment through the development of national policies, resources and education. So this area does include child safeguarding and member protection, and to a lesser extent, but is certainly involved in terms of the complaint and handling and dispute management function. And I will touch on that to a little extent towards the end of the presentation, if time permits. So when we're talking about the National Integrity Framework, we know that there are 6 policies that set out the expectations of all sport participants. And as part of that is the Safeguarding Children policy and the Member Protection policy. We know that each policy contains prohibited conduct relating to that policy behaviour that breaks the rules or breaches the policy is what we're talking about. So, for example, breaching the child safeguarding policy could be requesting communication with a child be kept secret from other adults. So should a person bound by the National Integrity Framework policies breach any policy, the Complaints, Disputes and Discipline policy kicks in, which allows for an independent, transparent, fair complaints management system to be undertaken. As a member of the Water Polo Australia team, you are bound by the National Integrity Framework. And so that just sets up a little bit of the background to what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. So let's go back to go forwards. And let's start with one of the key levers for institutional change. No doubt many of you will have heard of the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse. Now, this was established in 2013. And by 2017, we had a final report that was published where we heard stories of some 408 survivors of abuse in sporting organisations in particular. Many of these stories were of children being overtrained to the point of injury, being groomed into sexual relationships with adult coaching staff, or experiencing verbal and physical abuse with the offset to obtain better performance outcomes. So the idea of winning at all costs is often a comment that is broached when we talk about these types of concerns. We know that there are key areas where abuse potentially is likely to occur, particularly in a sporting environment, such as transporting children or overnight stays have been identified. Now, several recommendations, 128 to be precise, were provided by the Royal Commission and handed down to enhance safety for children in our community. And these included a wide variety of recommendations, such as hearing the voices of children and young people in each organisation, removing exemptions from working with children and working with vulnerable people checks, implementing mandatory reporting requirements, the development of a number of child protection policies, and a requirement for state and federal government, as well as sporting organisations, to provide an annual update to the Attorney General's office detailing the progress towards implementing these recommendations. Now, it is certainly encouraging to know that of these recommendations, at last count, 64 had been implemented with another 64 underway. Now, this is certainly a positive step in the right direction. And one such recommendation is the National Principles for Child Safe Organisations, also known as the National Principles, being developed by the National Children's Commissioner. The National Principles aim to create and enhance organisational cultures that prioritise child safety and wellbeing. And these national principles underpin Sport Integrity Australia's child safeguarding policy. The Safeguarding Unit, which is my team within Sport Integrity Australia, works with national sporting organisations to do a wide range of tasks, ultimately embedding safeguarding into their culture, ensuring everyone involved in sport understands that discrimination, harassment, bullying and abuse are absolutely unacceptable and will not be tolerated. Enabling anyone who has witnessed or experienced discrimination, harassment, bullying and abuse to report incidents without fear of victimisation or retaliation. To ensure a fair, appropriate and coordinated response to any incidents of discrimination, harassment, bullying and abuse within or connected to participation in sport. And of course, to minimise the likelihood of these incidents occurring through national policy, frameworks and supporting resources. The impact of abuse in sport can be far-reaching. Most people will have heard of, if not seen, the Netflix documentary Athlete A, which told the story of Larry Nassar, a USA gymnastics doctor that was charged with multiple offences of sexual abuse against young athletes. The impact on those young gymnasts, their families, and the gymnastics community globally is profound. It's more than likely that you will have read and seen an increase in the media of stories of abuse in Australian sport. Documentaries like Athlete A, whilst highlighting systemic failings in American gymnastics, shine a light on the ugly side to sport and have also, thankfully, led to other athletes and sporting participants feeling empowered to speak out. In Australia, we might be just getting started with our safeguarding journey, but we have an amazing opportunity to really make a difference. Abuse in sport is not a new phenomenon. It is more likely that we simply did not have the safety and the functions for people to feel safe and comfortable to come forwards. On that note, I would just like to make comment that a lot of people think that once we start to work and dabble in the safeguarding space, that we should actually see a reduction in the types of matters that come forward. But it's actually quite the contrary. We actually believe that as we increase education and awareness surrounding safeguarding and best practice, most importantly, we actually are creating a safe environment where children, young people, and potentially adults who were once children and young people feel safe to report current and potentially historical cases of abuse. Abuse in sport is quite nuanced, but certainly has some very particular aspects to it that are quite specific to the sporting framework. Athletes learn to accept extreme discomfort and pain and suppress vulnerability as part of common practice. They are often expected to train and compete while injured, to tolerate aggressive tactics on field by both competitors, and even endure sexually abusive practices potentially performed under the guise of medical support, as we saw in the Larry Nassar case. Athletes are expected to comply, be obedient, and respect authority, even when the people in authority are the abusers. There are additional safeguarding challenges in terms of maintaining oversight and observation over training venues, where athletes are often isolated from their families and support networks, which in turn makes them more vulnerable to abuse, especially sexual abuse. The norms, power imbalances, reward structures, values, and beliefs combine to establish a culture that prioritises an athlete's performance over their safety and well-being and ends up legitimising abusive behaviour, according to Dr. Victoria Roberts and Dr. Victor Sojo from the University of Melbourne. It is worth noting the privileged position that adults hold, often with an opportunity to ensure the safety of all athletes, especially children, young people, and other vulnerable members, by being the eyes and ears of sporting organisations. Sporting personnel can bear witness to dangerous practices within sport. For example, abusive coaching techniques. And we have seen this in a recent matter involving the American Water Polo Association, a case of an example of abusive coaching practices that led to the abuse of multiple young athletes, including competitors, where young athletes began using techniques that had been demonstrated on them by their coach. Now, in this matter, it was only when this started to occur during a match in front of an audience of parents, guardians, and other coaches that this practice was identified and called out. Up to that point in time, the young athletes had been experiencing this abuse, even though it was done in quite a public way. They were experiencing it quite privately, with many parents completely unaware of the practices that were entailing against their young people. So it's an opportunity for us to utilise these case studies to learn and to demonstrate the absolute essence of why we need safeguarding practices within sport in particular. So I'm going to attempt, see my technological skills, to showcase a short video. Please let me know if the sound is not working.
From our first flutter with the game, we felt it. We felt passion pulsing through our veins, our hearts beating from our chests. We felt excitement. We felt improvement. We strove to achieve our best. We felt friendship and belonging. We felt welcome, and we felt free. We felt invincible like our heroes. We felt everything amazing that kids' sport can be. But what we didn't know was how quickly these feelings can disappear from a child who feels unsafe, in danger, or who constantly lives in fear. Protecting kids in sport is everyone's responsibility. No child should ever be verbally or physically abused, threatened, intimidated, or neglected. No child should be subject to psychological abuse, grooming, or sexual abuse. And no child should be placed in danger or harm's way, or exposed to any age-inappropriate behaviours. Supplying children with drugs or alcohol, asking them to keep secrets, or breaching procedures around travel or change rooms is never tolerated. Nor are breaches of photography, communication, or physical contact practices, which can be subject to disciplinary action or possible criminal proceedings. If you have reason to believe a child is in immediate danger, call 000. And if you believe a child is at risk of being harmed, contact the relevant protection agency in your state or territory. Once you've done so, contact the appropriate person in your sport and Sport Integrity Australia to make us aware of the breach. And remember, it's an offence to fail to report a breach. It's everyone's responsibility to protect every child in sport, and together we can provide them with a safe space to create cherished childhood memories. For more information on the National Integrity Framework and your child's safeguarding policy, visit sportintegrity.gov.au.
And I'm going to attempt to now take us back to the presentation. And let's see if we can't get this slideshow to start up again. I may need to stop sharing if it's not working, so just let me know. Jonathan, can you see on the screen the copy of the video that I just showed, just the start of it still?
It's showing your presentation.
Okay, so I might just stop for a minute. Apologies for the confusion. Sometimes it just needs to reshare it again. So I might just get the slideshow ready and I'll start that one again. Okay, let's take 2 on that one. Now, hopefully you can see the slideshow, but I think I need to show it a little bit bigger for you to see it.
Yeah, you just need to maximize.
There we go. Can you see that okay?
Back to full screen, yep.
Brilliant. Okay, there you go. Sorry about the little hiccup there. So what we saw on that video was quite a clear list of prohibited conduct as per the child safeguarding policy. And that included such things like child abuse, grooming, misconduct with a child, requesting secret communication, the supply of alcohol or drugs, including medicines, without consent of a parent or guardian, and of course the breaching of any of the child safe practices. And what I would like to spend a fair amount of today's presentation on is actually unpacking those child safe practices. So Sport Integrity Australia is committed to safeguarding everyone involved in sport, including children, ensuring that they feel and are safe. The child safe practices have been developed to identify and prevent behaviour that may be harmful to children in sport. A breach of the child safe practices is a breach of the policy. Now, there may be exceptional situations, for example, emergencies where aspects of the child safe practices do not apply. It is crucial, where possible, that you seek authorisation prior to taking action that does not comply with these standards, or notify the organisation as soon as possible after any incident. I'm going to take a little bit of time to work my way through these child safe practices. And if you do have a question, please take note of it, and we'll absolutely find some time at the end to go into it in more detail. So we start with filming and photography of children. Ultimately, before any imagery can be taken of a child or young person or a vulnerable member of our community, we require informed consent be provided by the parent or carer. Now, this is not just a blanket waiver. This does need to be conscious that there are children who potentially have court orders in place, and so the seeking of informed consent is absolutely essential to ensure the safety of all children and young people. So as part of that informed consent, what we're looking to provide parents and guardians with is really information around why you're taking the photography or the videography and what you plan on doing with that. That is both in terms of who you plan on sharing it with, how you plan on showcasing the information, if at all, and where you're planning on storing it, for how long, and how will you effectively destroy the imagery in good time. So it is around acknowledging that parents and guardians require the information to be able to provide that informed consent. But also, it doesn't hurt considering actually informing this to children and young people themselves. You may not need to go into as much detail depending on the age of the child, but certainly letting them know that they actually do have a choice and that they do not have to have their photo or video taken if they do not feel comfortable. And this really does start the process of actually encouraging children and young people to feel safe to speak up and to speak for themselves around what makes them feel safe as part of our sporting organisations. Photos should never be taken for personal use, and they should not be forwarded or shared beyond with permission from the organisation and for direct purposes of the sport. So we want these images to be taken appropriately in the context of the sport, where obviously we expect children to be dressed appropriately, and we want these images to be taken in context of other adults. We do not want a child and an adult taking one-on-one photography or videography that the organisation has not given any permission to, but more importantly, that there are not multiple adults in full sight of that. Next, we get on to the transportation of children. When we're talking about transportation of children, it's actually really pertinent to sport because we do not want any child or young person missing out on the benefits and the opportunities that sport provides simply because they cannot get to the location where it's held. That being said, we cannot allow children and young people to be put in harm's way and in high-risk situations simply because of convenience. So we do need to consider this quite seriously and determine a risk assessment of any practices that involve the transportation of children. So what does that mean? It means that we're looking to provide, once again, informed consent and information to parents so that they can actually provide permission, knowing where the transport is, the type of transport, where is it going, are there any stops on the way, who will be part of that, who will be picked up on the way, what adults are involved, where are they going, where are they going to be meeting back, the timeframes, and all those details combine to form a picture that allows them to provide informed consent. So it's around really making sure that that transport is directly related to the event, directly related to the sport and the need for it to happen, but also taking into consideration the safety mechanisms. So making sure that children are in the back seat, if they need to be in relevant car safety devices, that they are, and of course that the driver is not incapacitated and has a full and unrestricted licence. Moving on from transportation of students and children to the giving of gifts, and I do want to take a little bit of extra time on this because often people misunderstand what it is we're saying when we're talking about not providing gifts to children or favours. And ultimately what we're talking about is grooming. And certainly this is a word that has become far more commonplace and practice in the broader community. But I will still take the time to explain it because not everyone understands the full scope that grooming can entail. So grooming is when an individual persuades a child to have a special relationship with them. And this can encompass a wide range of activities and inappropriate acts, including spending special time with a child, giving gifts to a child, showing special favours to one child over others, allowing a child to step out of boundaries or rules, touching a child, and testing and breaking professional boundaries. It is worth noting that grooming often takes place towards adults as well as children and can sometimes begin with the grooming of parents and guardians to gain access to a child. So it can be very difficult for a child to recognise that this is an inappropriate relationship because they often have the support of their parents. It is not uncommon for entire communities, for entire organisations, sporting clubs to be groomed. Often we hear when cases come to light of an upstanding citizen, somebody who is well known and well liked within a community, who's always willing to go that extra mile, who volunteers heavily, who's always able to provide support, particularly to highly vulnerable populations. So it's not around that children don't have the opportunity to win awards and the likes, or even to receive a gift. All we're saying is that each child receives an equal opportunity to receive that gift or that award, and that it is done with parental awareness and presence. So we're not saying to take away the best and fairest awards at the end of the season, but we are saying that every child should have an equal opportunity to receive that award. And likewise, if you would like to give a small token for Christmas at the end of the year, that each child gets the opportunity to receive that. Moving on to the tone and language that we use to talk to children and young people. It's really around the fact that we never want to shame a child or make derogatory or belittling comments. We don't want to be naming a child as a loser or commenting on their weight. We never want to humiliate or intimidate or regularly criticise a child, and we certainly don't want to single them out. Our language should be age appropriate, and certainly there are times where we do need to address inappropriate behaviour, but we would expect that that would be an education that is equally applied to all children and young people, so that they have a clear awareness of what is within boundaries and scope, and how they should be behaving appropriately, both towards each other, to their coaching, to the staff, to everyone involved, so that everyone has a right to feel and be safe within sport. When we talk about physical contact with children, we often talk about it needing to be appropriate to the delivery of the sport program. Now, being aware that being physical in sport is often required, whether it be for treatment, for first aid, to demonstrate how to use equipment, or how to even enact a particular skill. What we say is that this should be done in clear view of other adults. But more to the point, that children should be allowed the opportunity to know what's going to happen, and, to be honest, given an opportunity to give consent and permission. So it could be something as simple as, I'd like to show you how we do this. May I please touch your shoulder here? Now, it's around enabling them to be able to speak up and say, actually, I don't feel comfortable. And that's okay. There are ways that we can work around that. And it's a conversation that can start something for both the young people, the parents, and the broader community within the sport. But it is certainly something that we do need to adhere to. And we need to be really conscious if there is medical treatment that is being involved. We need to be conscious that parents are aware and that young people are aware of what that practice may involve, and certainly making sure that the organisation has given permission. So there are a number of practices, and the policy certainly outlines a lot more specific information in relation to this so that you can unpack it further. We are exceedingly living in a digital world, and so the use of online and electronic communication with children and young people is front of mind. We often talk about a too deep model, whereby we expect that the organisation and the parent or guardian is copied into any direct communication with children and young people. We do know, though, that that's not always feasible, particularly with the increasing use of apps like WhatsApp, particularly involving camps or overnight stays, where it may be required that you need to actually speak directly to children and young people where their parents are actually not involved in the discussion. So what we say in those circumstances is to make sure that it is not a private one-on-one chat with a young person, but rather the entire group, and that there are multiple adults, at least 2 from the organisation, that are involved in that conversation. I would also argue that it would be relevant to raise that to parents prior to utilising that platform. So as part of that informed consent process, letting them know that we may need to communicate with your child on this application. This is how we do it. This is the details that we will be going into, and that giving them the opportunity, should they want to be a part of that conversation. But certainly making certain that none of these conversations or communication is kept secret or away from parents and guardians. It should not be a private conversation that is being held between children, young people, and any member of your team within the organisation. Ultimately, we are welcoming the involvement of parents. We want them to actively want to participate and be part of our sport. We want them to volunteer. We want them to be present. So it is around that careful balancing act, though, when we know that there are times when parents and guardians do not always behave appropriately during training and matches that involve their children. So it is certainly appropriate to set a tone and appropriate behaviour and acknowledge that with parents and guardians around what you expect of them, a code of conduct to be precise. And it is appropriate that if a parent steps outside of that code of conduct, that they can be penalised. However, they cannot be kept away from training and matches indefinitely. There has to be a set period of time with which they are kept away so that they can learn from their behaviour and come back. We do not want parents separated from the practices involving their children and young people. We want them to become a valued member of the team as we support all young people to have a positive and safe experience within sport. We talked before about transportation, so it's actually important that we touch on pickups and drop-offs as well as part of that process. Certainly, it is not appropriate for any adult to leave a child behind. They need to remain there until all children have been collected. That being said, it is still not appropriate for an adult to offer a lift home that has not been pre-authorised under the appropriate conditions of the policy. So it's important that there is an awareness of alternative pickup arrangements and that this is communicated to parents. It is their responsibility to ensure that their children and young people have a safe drop-off and pickup arranged for every single session. Now we move to overnight stays, and it's important that we mention here that with regard to overnight stays, that all of the child safe practices that we've been talking about up until this point are still important and still part of the common practice. Where it differs, however, is obviously the need to have quite extensive informed consent, and this is documented informed consent. We want parents to know exactly where their young people are going to be staying. We want them to know the duration, the timeframes, how they're getting there, who will be there, what the supervision arrangements are, and any other pertinent information. Likewise, we want them to communicate with the organisation and the people running the program what their child needs to keep them safe. If there's any additional information that they should be aware of, given it involves overnight stays and sleepovers, but also to absolutely confirm any sort of emergency contact information and the likes. So to make sure that you have absolutely up-to-date contact information should anything go wrong. And of course, to demonstrate a risk assessment profile prior to any kind of event such as this, so that you are thinking about anything that could possibly go wrong and what steps you would take to ensure the safety of all children and young people. Now, there are some very specific requirements as part of an overnight stay that do need to be adhered to. So, of course, we do not want children coming into contact with any adult inappropriate material, but certainly we also want them to be able to call out if they're not feeling safe and to feel that they can reach out to their parents or guardians or other relevant and important adults in their life. We don't want parents having concerns that they can't reach their child as well. So they need to be informed of what's happening and who they need to reach out to if there are any concerns from their end. Likewise, children can certainly share rooms with other children of a similar age and gender, but they certainly cannot share a room with an adult. And that may involve, sometimes in your under 18 teams, 18-year-old students who are involved in the sport. So it's about being conscious of grouping students who are of a certain age together. Likewise, we do not encourage at any point in time for children to be sharing a bed. Whilst they can certainly share a room, they do have a right to privacy and to their own personal space. And that leads quite beautifully into change room arrangements. We want change rooms to be appropriately supervised, but we have to balance the requirement for privacy for children when they are bathing, when they are in a state of undress. And so we do need to balance this need for privacy with the need to ensure that they are appropriately supervised, be it from themselves, from a public environment, if it is a public change room, or from any other adult that may access the change room at any time if it's a private facility. But certainly it's more around balancing the need of what those children require as well to be ready. So recognising their developmental stage, and particularly if you have children with a disability, making sure that you know ahead of time what requirements and support or assistance they may require, and speaking to parents and guardians and having that well documented. We don't want to be giving any additional support that a children and young person doesn't require. Ultimately, we want them to be able to take care of themselves to the fullest extent possible. But ultimately, it does come down to the fact that we do want to avoid one-to-one situations in change rooms between adults and children. And this is sometimes a slightly tricky position to be in, but certainly one that planning ahead can help. We don't want any children and adults to be in a situation where grooming can occur. And this is one of the reasons why we are trying to create child-safe environments. We are removing the opportunity for harm to occur. All children have a fundamental right to feel safe and be protected from all forms of abuse, harm, and neglect. Children have the right to take part in sport in a safe, positive, and enjoyable environment. The Child Safeguarding Policy was developed in response to findings and recommendations from a number of inquiries investigating the failure to keep children participating in sport safe. The inquiries recognised that sport plays an important role in the protection of children against child abuse, harm, and neglect. The recommendations identified safeguarding is not only about establishing effective policies and procedures, but also to foster a positive culture where children can safely participate in sport, free from harm and all forms of abuse. Now, earlier I did touch on the Royal Commission final report, whereby a number of common failings were identified that were quite specific and unique to a sporting organisation that led to children being harmed. These failings included inadequate child protection policies, the inability to keep appropriate records, failure to notify the police or other authorities on being made aware of allegations, and failure to properly provide support for victims of sexual abuse. In response, the Royal Commission made a number of recommendations that I touched on before to help prevent child abuse, and if it does occur, to help ensure effective responses are in place. These recommendations, as I mentioned earlier, include hearing voices of children and young people, removing exemptions for working with children checks for volunteers and working with vulnerable people checks. That parents and self-employed people are also considered in part of those exemptions. Mandatory reporting requirements are considered. The development of child protection policies and providing these policies to all people at the time of joining the club and renewing membership. And that is also to consider how you disseminate this information to children and young people themselves in an appropriate way so that they are aware of their rights, but also their responsibilities to ensure the safety of everyone involved. So when we come down to it, when we look at the child safeguarding story to date, every article that is on this screen presents another opportunity where a child or young person could have been protected. They go across all different types of sports. There's definitely no sport that is immune. And predators, we know, will often find gaps. Where possible in sport, they use it as an opportunity. So what are our key safeguarding recommendations? Ultimately, it comes down to two aspects: to deter, removing any opportunity for our child to be harmed, and to detect, providing clear guidance to everyone for reporting concerns. The policy aims to foster a safe and positive environment for all children, young people, and vulnerable members within sport. These have been developed in response to the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse and are underpinned by the National Principles for Child Safe Organisations, state and territory child protection legislation. Now, we know that this is not an easy thing to start taking into consideration for sports that often have never had to even consider these requirements and recommendations. So at Sport Integrity Australia, we are keen to develop a number of resources to assist sports to implement the policy. And one such resource is the Child Safe Practices Do's and Don'ts booklet, which is available on our website. This booklet provides practical guidance on how to implement child-safe practices as outlined in the Child Safeguarding Policy, covering such topics as sexual misconduct, professional boundaries, use of language and tone of voice, positive guidance or discipline, the supervision of children, the use of electronic or online communication, photography of children, physical contact with children, overnight stays and travel arrangements, the use, possession or supply of drugs or alcohol, parent and guardian involvement, transporting children, drop-off and pick-up of children, and change room arrangements. Now, I've got one example here just to touch on, knowing that you will get the full access to the report, so I won't go into too much detail. But certainly we can see that when we look at transportation, for example, there are a number of things that we would like to see put in place to begin with. We've touched on the need for written approval, but here it itemises exactly what information should be included as part of that parental permission slip, so to speak. We touched on children sitting appropriately secured in back seats and, of course, ensuring that the driver is not impaired. But certainly, there are a range of activities that we don't want to encourage. And we look at the fact that we don't need to transport children if it's not actually necessary. We certainly don't want to let others who are unauthorised to travel along for the journey. So we certainly don't stop on the way just to pick up a friend. So that is part of the informed consent, where parents know who will be part of that transport. Also, we know we don't want to make any unnecessary or unplanned steps, of course, bearing in mind that emergencies do happen. But certainly, where practicable, we do not want an adult to be alone and unsupervised with a child. We don't need children sitting in front seats, and we certainly don't want children taken to personal members' homes. Now, these are just some examples, but certainly the safeguarding team are here to work with your sport. So if you are having some challenging understandings of how to actually implement this in your sport, we're very happy to work with you to help understand what are the nuances for your organisation and how we can work with you to ensure the safety of everyone involved. Here's another example in relation to overnight stays and travel arrangements. So as we said before, obtaining written approval prior to the overnight stay, and that can be in terms of an electronic message, such as email or SMS at times as well. We know that children require privacy, as we mentioned earlier, when bathing, toileting and dressing, and that appropriate dress standards should be present. So there should be no exposure to adult nudity. We do not want the safety of children being compromised in any way, shape or form throughout an overnight stay or travel arrangements. And so we do expect the policy to be upheld in terms of its full extent when travelling or having an overnight stay with a child or young person. But we do specify that in relation to overnight stays around appropriate sleeping environments that we talked about before, about children having access to reach out to important adults in their life if they're feeling distressed or unsafe. And of course, ensuring that we have adequate supervision. We want accommodation to be pre-planned. We want to know that children have an appropriate and safe and private place for them to sleep and change throughout the course of the overnight stay. And certainly taking into consideration age and gender and no sharing of beds by young people or adults with young people. And as I mentioned before, of course, risk assessing and making sure that you are prepared for anything that could go wrong, and certainly making sure that this is documented and that parents are aware of this. We want parents to be familiar and understand what are the requirements for the trip, but certainly we want children and young people to also be privy to this information and certainly being aware of a code of conduct in terms of what is expected of them and what is appropriate behaviour. Certainly there are a number of don'ts when it comes to overnight stays with children. And as I mentioned before, we don't want children exposed to adult pornographic material of any way, shape or form. We don't want children being left unsupervised or supervised by others who have not been pre-approved. And of course, we don't want adults alone in rooms with children and young people. And that is very much for the safety of the adult and the child involved. We certainly don't want children's clothing being removed even in an emergency unless you have permission and at least there is another adult present. And certainly we don't want you entering children's rooms or inviting them to attend into your own room. So as we mentioned before, particularly relevant for children who have additional needs, ensuring that if there are personal responsibilities and requirements that they need, that this is documented well ahead in advance by their parents and guardians. And so we don't do anything for children and young people that they can do for themselves. So that's one resource. Another resource that is relevant and worthy of taking the time to have a look at on our website is the Responding to Child Abuse Allegations flowchart. Now, it might be a little bit difficult to see on the screen today, but the most important point is to really understand your reporting obligations and know that you absolutely must report if you suspect any kind of child abuse or neglect. Now, this involves potentially reporting to police and or relevant child protection authorities in your state, depending on the severity or the current risk of immediate harm as is demonstrated in the flowchart. Certainly then, if there is any kind of suspicion on reasonable grounds that the child is at risk of being abused or neglected, even despite there not being immediate harm, we would expect that the local police and authorities are being contacted. If there is a potential for an alleged breach of the child safeguarding policy, it is certainly appropriate to bypass the need to report to child protection and police if you do not believe there is current risk of harm, and to speak directly to your relevant Water Polo Child Safe Contact or National Integrity Manager, and of course, contact Sport Integrity Australia. To be perfectly frank, if you had a concern for the safety of a child or young person, we would actively be encouraging you to reach out to the relevant authorities, because even if you don't, we will from our end. We want to know that you understand your reporting obligations in this and acknowledge that not reporting is a breach of the National Integrity Framework. So you absolutely must report if you have any concern whatsoever. And it's important to recognise that in some states, it is actually a criminal offence not to report if you have a reasonable suspicion of child abuse. So just to reiterate that, because it's absolutely essential that you understand your reporting obligations. The safeguarding regulatory environment in Australia currently includes quite an extensive group of organisations, including state-based child protection legislation working nationally in a federated system, gives you a combination of multiple state legislation to be aware of. Failure to protect legislation is present in New South Wales and Victoria, and failure to protect legislation in Queensland. There are regulatory schemes and standards such as the New South Wales Child Safe Standards and Victorian Child Safe Standards, working with children checks and working with vulnerable people checks, and the Commonwealth Child Safe Framework. It's important to note, though, safeguarding is not a tick-the-box exercise that hinders getting out and having fun in sport. As we are already understanding, unfortunately, there are absolutely people who are using sport as a means to access victims. And the best way of stopping this is by creating environments that are safe in the first place. At Sport Integrity Australia, we understand that we need to have a strong understanding across our agency on how we collaborate. And these operations are critical to keep safe sport for everyone involved across all levels. So it is essential that you report any suspected child abuse and neglect, of course, to police and relevant authorities and child protection agencies, to your relevant Water Polo Child Safe Contact and National Integrity Manager, and of course to Sport Integrity Australia, so that we can partner together to ensure the safety of sport for everyone involved. Now, I am conscious of time, but I would like to share this short video, and I'm hoping that the sound works, so please let me know if it doesn't. I might have to just try that one again. Let's see if I can make that work. Okay, we're all set up. Let me know, Jonathan, if you can't hear it. It does take a minute for the sound to start, though.
I've recently been investigated by the LTA safeguarding team, and unfortunately my story is a common one. I grew up playing tennis at my local tennis club. I was the best junior in the club, and when I finished school it was the natural choice for me to stay at the club and become a tennis coach, and I worked my way up to be a level 3 accredited coach. I quickly built up a lot of tennis lessons, and I was earning good money for someone of my age. Last year the club ran summer camps, and we had the same group of teenagers at the camp for a couple of weeks. It was at one of these camps that Nicole started sending me messages. She was one of the girls at the camp. She found me on Instagram and sent me a friend invite, which I accepted. I didn't think much of it at the time. She was 14 years old and seemed very grown up for her age. Nicole liked some of my Instagram posts, and I felt I should like hers back to be friendly. Later that year, Nicole posted a photo of herself playing tennis, and it was a great pic. Instead of liking the pic, I decided to send her a private comment saying something like, "Great forehand, you must have an awesome coach." I sent a winking emoji with the message. Nicole responded straight away by personal message on Snapchat. She said Snapchat was better for messaging on. And then we sent a number of messages that evening, about tennis at first. And then Nicole asked me for advice about a boy from her school. She seemed really upset in her messages, so I began finishing my messages with XX. I also sent her a photo of myself on Snapchat. It wasn't anything bad, it was just a photo of me on a recent holiday. Nicole sent me a photo back from her summer holiday too. The messages finished because it got to 11 PM and my last message said something like, "Sleep well, XX." I just sent it to be friendly and I didn't mean much of it. A few days later, I received notification from the LTA safeguarding team that my accreditation in coaching children had been immediately suspended whilst they looked into a safeguarding concern. They told me that the reasons for this were that they had received allegations from a girl and her parents that I'd been sending inappropriate messages to a 14-year-old on social media. The case by law also had to be referred to the police and the local authority. I was shocked and confused. The messages and photos that I'd sent were on Snapchat, and so they disappeared and I couldn't prove the content of any of them. The only message I still had was the message I sent with a winking face, which, looking back, did look quite flirtatious and was really inappropriate for a coach to send to a young girl. It also looked suspicious that we'd moved from chatting on Instagram to Snapchat, where the messages disappear. I've been totally stupid, and when I look back and looked at the messages I sent, I could see how someone could have looked at them and thought that I meant something more than being friendly on them. I wouldn't have wanted someone in a position of trust to send things like that to someone in my family, especially a child. I was also mad at myself because I should have known better than to send a child messages like that. I was suspended whilst the police and then the safeguarding team investigated the case. It turned my world upside down. I lost my income and my personal life suffered and my reputation's in tatters. Before this happened, I was enjoying getting the attention I was getting on social media. But now I realise that my social media accounts should have been private. I think I struggled with the transition from being a junior player to be a coach at the same club. And I was naive to think that I shouldn't have to change my behaviour when I became a coach. I now realise I need to act professionally both on and off the tennis court. And I hope other coaches can now learn from my experience. We're in positions of responsibility. These kids look up to us, and the consequences of not maintaining these boundaries can be devastating.
Okay, hopefully, Jonathan, we've gone back to the slide presentation.
Yes, still in the slide presentation.
Excellent. Okay, so this presentation highlights how important it is for everyone involved to abide by the policies. Of course, we are educating sports to do this to ensure the safety of children, young people, and other vulnerable members of our communities. But we are also running sessions like these to ensure that people in positions of trust are aware of their responsibilities. And this includes coaches and other support staff who potentially are minors, and this happens quite frequently in sport. Now, I'm conscious that we don't have a great deal of time left, so I will just touch on, because it would be remiss of me not to mention that there, of course, is prohibited conduct involved in the member protection policy. Now, there are clear definitions involved in the policy, and I won't go into any detail today, just conscious of time, but certainly we know that abuse, bullying, harassment, sexual misconduct, unlawful discrimination, victimisation and vilification are absolutely not acceptable in sport for any members involved. Now, that does include, obviously, children, young people and vulnerable members, but certainly it's much more broad context that all members have a right to feel and be safe. Now, I'm certain this has been captured in some of the earlier sessions, but I'll just touch on the fact that Sport Integrity Australia will manage complaints so long as they meet a particular criteria. So it's important to note that the alleged prohibited conduct must have occurred after the National Sporting Organisation commenced operating under the National Integrity Framework in order for Sport Integrity Australia to be able to manage the complaint. So we cannot manage complaints that occurred with regard to conduct prior to the NIF adoption, and also with regard to conduct that occurred within a sport that has not yet adopted the National Integrity Framework. So information provided to Sport Integrity Australia outside of formal complaints are still used to inform trends and themes of issues present in sporting organisations, which we can then use to inform our capability and education programs, but we of course cannot manage this information through a complaints process. It is also important to acknowledge that if you wish to make a report anonymously, you can still report to Sport Integrity Australia, and we can refer this to law enforcement if appropriate, but we cannot take action. And there are certainly a wide variety of breaches that meet the criteria, but there are some specific areas that we won't or can't manage, and they often include things like competition rules, code of conduct, personal grievances, social media, including inappropriate commentary or misuse of social media pages where the matter doesn't meet definitions under the member protection policy or the safeguarding children policy, and employment matters, so an employee acting in the course of their employment duties. So sporting organisations can still and are encouraged to maintain a range of policies outside of the National Integrity Framework. So what happens when something falls out of scope is it will be referred back to them. So we do manage complaints of alleged breaches of the policies. And what this means for you is that if a prohibited conduct as it relates to the specific policy falls into scope, then absolutely the complaint to Sport Integrity Australia can be managed by Sport Integrity Australia. However, out of scope complaints will be referred back to Water Polo Australia. So as I mentioned, personal grievances, code of conduct, selection disputes, etc. So the other policies which sit alongside the National Integrity Framework, such as personal grievances, code of conduct, etc., still require the sport organisational involvement. And so that's how we work to partner together to ensure safe sport for all. Now, just as we get to the tail end, I'd love to just highlight the Sport Integrity app, which has a one-stop shop for all things integrity, including anti-doping. And so you'll see that there are a lot of opportunities for you to download this and utilise it to your advantage. And we encourage all support personnel should have this app on their phone. So certainly there are some relevant information and ability for you to then engage directly with Sport Integrity Australia as required. And so from the safeguarding front in particular, we're talking about the ability to report any type of integrity issue, and certainly a whole range of other opportunities for our other policy areas. And just as we get to the tail end of the presentation today, if you'd like to take a shot of this screen, please feel free to do that to access the app. And you could also utilise this one if you like to give us some feedback, which we always welcome. You could feel free to reach out via feedback form, email, website or phone to let us know, have we covered the information that you wanted to see today? And if there's something that we've missed, please feel free to reach out to us directly, including to our safeguarding team. We'd be only too happy to work with you and to help. So I'm sorry I haven't left a great deal of time for questions, but I'll leave it there. And of course, if there are any additional questions, we can always be contacted directly at Sport Integrity Australia to continue the conversation. So I'll stop sharing my screen now, Jonathan. I'll give it back to you.
Thanks, Rachel. So do we have any questions? A few moments in case anyone has any questions, feel free to sing out. Looks like we don't have any questions, so I'll just thank you for that, Rachel. Very comprehensive presentation on child safeguarding, very useful information in there. Like Rachel said, if you have any additional questions, I'll just add the Water Polo Australia email to that as well, in case you need to speak to us, and we can also get into contact with Rachel and Sport Integrity Australia if there's something that you'd like to ask offline. The Water Polo email is wpaintegrity@waterpoloaustralia.com.au, and we'll also be posting this online. So for those of you that are watching this back, you can use that email, those contact details at any time if any questions come up. Thank you again, Rachel, for everyone that's attended and for those watching. Look forward to speaking to you all again soon.
Thanks very much, Jonathan. Appreciate the opportunity.
Thanks very much. Okay.